The pen felt heavier than it should have, like it knew it was about to change my life. That's the moment I always return to, the quiet scrape of ink on paper, the way my husband's hand hovered just a little too close to mine, as if he could guide my signature the way you guide a child learning to write their name. The house was too still. No bird song outside the tall windows, no hum from the old refrigerator down the hall, just the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, counting something down I didn't yet understand. I remember thinking, why does my chest feel so tight? At the time, I told myself it was nerves. I told myself it was just another adult responsibility, another document in a long marriage built on trust. But something inside me, quiet, persistent, was whispering that this wasn't just paperwork. It was a goodbye. Before all of that, before the pen and the clock and the lawyer's office that smelled faintly of lemon polish, my life had been steady. Not perfect, just steady, in the way you learn to appreciate when you've lived long enough to know chaos. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I was 58 years old when my husband, Grant, asked me to sign away my rights to the house I had lived in for nearly 20 years, the house everyone in town called the mansion, though to me it was just home. The house sat on a gentle hill at the edge of Maplewood, a quiet town where people waved even if they didn't know your name. It had white stone walls that glowed soft and warm in the late afternoon sun, tall windows that caught the light just right, and a wraparound porch where I drank my morning coffee wrapped in a cardigan my mother had knitted decades earlier. The mansion wasn't Grant's dream, it was mine. I bought it before I met him, back when I was still running my interior design business out of a cramped downtown office, back when my hands smelled like paint samples and fresh fabric swatches. I had worked for that house, late nights, missed vacations, learning to negotiate without apologizing for taking up space. Signing those papers at the closing table all those years ago had felt like proof that my life belonged to me. When Grant and I married 5 years later, I welcomed him into that life, into that house. He liked to tell people he'd married well, always with a laugh, always with his arm around my waist. I took it as a compliment then. I didn't hear the ownership in it, not yet. Our days fell into an easy rhythm. Grant worked in financial consulting, numbers, contracts, words small enough to hide big meanings. I scaled back my business as the years went on, taking only the projects that brought me joy. We had no children together, though he had a son from his first marriage who visited on holidays, polite and distant, like someone stopping by a museum rather than a home. Mornings were quiet. Grant liked his coffee black, I liked mine with cream and just a touch of sugar. He read the paper at the long kitchen island while I watered the plants lining the windowsill. The house always smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. On Sundays, I made roast chicken, and he praised it like it was a ritual rather than a recipe. From the outside, we looked solid, comfortable, the kind of couple people pointed to when they talked about doing it right the second time around. But comfort can dull your senses. It can teach you not to ask questions. The first time something felt off was so small I almost laughed at myself for noticing. Grant started locking his study door. It wasn't dramatic, no slammed doors or raised voices, just a quiet click at the end of the hallway when he thought I was busy folding laundry or on the phone. When I asked him about it, he smiled that same easy smile he'd always used, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Client confidentiality," he said lightly. "You know how it is." I did, or at least I thought I did. So I nodded, I let it go. Then came the mail. Grant had always been casual about it, left envelopes scattered on the entry table, bills mixed with catalogs. But suddenly, the mailbox was empty when I checked it in the afternoons. He started bringing the mail in himself, tucking it neatly into his briefcase as if it were part of his job. "Anything interesting today?" I asked once, trying to sound casual as I rinsed dishes at the sink. "Just junk," he replied too quickly. "Nothing worth bothering you about." I remember the way he didn't look at me when he said it. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. Marriage, especially at our age, was supposed to be safe, predictable. I had no interest in turning into a suspicious woman counting receipts and passwords. The real shift came when he started talking about the house differently. He began calling it our asset. Not our home, not the place where I planted roses every spring, or where the banister still bore a faint scratch from when I moved in my first antique armoire. An asset, a word that made the walls feel suddenly temporary. "Property taxes are going up," he said one evening, swirling ice in his glass of bourbon. "We should think strategically." Strategically, another word that felt sharp around the edges. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means being smart," he replied, "protecting what we have." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his grip firm, reassuring. I remember the weight of his wedding band against my skin. "You trust me, don't you, Ellie?" I did, or at least I thought I did. So when he suggested we meet with a lawyer just to tidy things up, I agreed. I wore my good coat, I brought my reading glasses, I sat in that leather chair across from a man who spoke smoothly about estates and contingencies and future-proofing. And when the papers slid across the desk toward me, thick and neatly clipped, I didn't yet understand I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. All I knew was that the pen still felt too heavy, and my husband was watching me very closely. The lawyer's office was colder than it needed to be. Not temperature-wise. It was climate-controlled to a perfect, forgettable 72 degrees, but cold in the way places feel when they're designed to move people through quickly. Leather chairs without softness, abstract art that meant nothing, a faint smell of lemon cleaner layered over old paper and ink. Grant sat beside me, close enough that our knees touched. His posture was relaxed, confident. He looked like he belonged there. I realized with a flicker of unease that he probably did. The lawyer, a man named Douglas Reeve, gray at the temples, voice smooth as polished wood, spoke in calm, measured tones. He explained things the way professionals do when they don't expect questions. "This is a standard restructuring of ownership," he said, sliding a document toward me with 2 fingers. "Given your marital status and long-term planning goals, this protects both parties." I flipped through the pages slowly, too slowly, perhaps. Legal language has a way of making you feel foolish for wanting clarity. Words stretched on for lines and lines, each sentence folded into the next like a maze designed to exhaust you before you find the center. "Grant explained this to you, correct?" Mr. Reeve asked. Grant's hand found my back, warm and steady. "Of course I did," he said, before I could answer. "Ellie just likes to be thorough." I smiled reflexively. I had always liked being thorough. It was how I'd built my business, how I'd bought the house, how I'd lived my life. Still, something tugged at me as I scanned the pages again. My name appeared often enough, but not in the way I expected. Words like transfer, exclusive authority, irrevocable, floated up like warnings I didn't yet know how to read. "Is this permanent?" I asked, tapping the paper lightly. Mr. Reeve glanced at Grant, then back at me. "It's designed to streamline management. In practical terms, nothing changes day to day." Grant leaned closer, his voice low, intimate. "It's just for efficiency, Ellie. You know how messy things can get if something happens to one of us." Something happens. I thought of my mother, how quickly illness had taken her independence, how overwhelmed I'd felt handling her affairs, wishing she'd made things simpler. I thought of love as partnership, of marriage as mutual protection. So I signed. The pen scratched softly across the page, once, twice, 3 times. With every stroke, the air felt heavier, though I couldn't have said why. When I finished, Grant squeezed my shoulder, his smile wide and relieved. "See?" he said. "Easy." The lawyer gathered the papers, already moving on to the next client in his mind. We walked out into the sunlight, and I remember blinking, surprised by how bright the day felt. The world hadn't ended. The house still stood on its hill. My roses would still bloom. Or so I believed. The first time it hit me that something had changed was 2 weeks later, standing in my own kitchen. I was reorganizing a drawer, one of those mindless tasks you do when you're avoiding something you can't name, when Grant came in, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, that's fine," he said, pacing near the island. "I have full authority now." I froze, my hand still wrapped around a bundle of rubber bands. "Go ahead and move it. I'll handle the rest." He hung up and noticed me watching. "What was that about?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay light. "Work," he replied, a little too quickly, "just moving some things around." I nodded, but my stomach tightened. Full authority. The words echoed later that night as I lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I told myself I was overreacting, that marriage meant sharing control, trusting judgment. Still, I found myself staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint crack that ran above our bed, the one I'd noticed years ago and never bothered to fix. A week after that, the landscaper didn't show up. I called his number, confused. He had been coming every Thursday for over a decade. "Oh," he said awkwardly when he answered. "Mr. Whitfield called, said you didn't need my services anymore." My grip tightened on the phone. "He did?" "Yeah," the landscaper replied. "Told me everything was being scaled back." Scaled back? When I asked Grant about it that evening, he sighed, as if I were the unreasonable one. "We're cutting unnecessary expenses," he said. "You said yourself we should simplify." "I said we should donate more, not fire people who've worked for us for years." He waved a dismissive hand. "It's the same thing in the long run." It wasn't. Little by little, decisions were made without me. The housekeeper's schedule changed, the wine club membership was canceled, even my antique dealer called to confirm an order Grant had declined on my behalf. "You told him to stop?" I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. "I told him we don't need more clutter," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "We should be thinking about resale value." Resale value. The house felt different then, quieter, less mine. I started opening drawers just to reassure myself they were still there, running my fingers along the banister, standing in the doorway of the sunroom, breathing in the familiar scent of old wood and citrus polish. One afternoon, while Grant was out, I went to the filing cabinet in his study. The door was unlocked. I hesitated, my heart pounding louder than it should. I had never gone through his things before. It felt like crossing a line I hadn't known existed. But curiosity, once awakened, is hard to put back to sleep. Inside the cabinet were neatly labeled folders: investments, clients, property. My breath caught at the last one. I slid the folder out and opened it. There, clipped together with clinical precision, were copies of the documents I'd signed. But these weren't the same versions I remembered. These were finalized, filed, official. I scanned them quickly now, panic sharpening my focus. Exclusive ownership, transfer of title, sole decision-making authority. My name appeared only once in the past tense. I sank into the desk chair, the leather cold against my skin. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in. I hadn't just signed paperwork. I had signed myself out of my own home. The realization settled slowly, like dust after a collapse. I thought of every moment I'd trusted him, every casual reassurance, every gentle squeeze of my hand. That night, I confronted him. We stood in the living room, the same room where we'd hosted dinners and toasted anniversaries. The grandfather clock ticked steadily behind us, an indifferent witness. "You took my name off the house," I said. Grant didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. "I streamlined things," he replied. "There's a difference." "You said nothing would change," I whispered. "And nothing has," he said calmly. "You still live here, don't you?" The way he said live, as if it were a privilege, not a right, made something inside me go still. "What happens if you decide I shouldn't?" I asked. He shrugged, a small, almost apologetic gesture. "Ellie, you're being dramatic." Dramatic? I looked around the room, at the walls I'd chosen, the floors I'd refinished with my own hands, at the life I had built before him. And for the first time since I'd known Grant, I saw him clearly, not as my husband, but as a man who had been waiting patiently for me to stop paying attention. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. I needed help. Not from friends, not from family, from someone who understood the language I had ignored. A lawyer, one who didn't already belong to my husband. Finding a lawyer felt like learning a new language while already underwater. I sat at the small desk in the guest room, laptop open, the house unnervingly quiet around me. Grant had left early that morning without his usual goodbye kiss, his absence louder than any argument. I could still hear his words from the night before echoing in my mind. "You're being dramatic." Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere down the street. Life, it seemed, was continuing without regard for my unraveling. I typed slowly, "Property rights lawyer, Maplewood." Names and firms appeared on the screen, each one promising experience, expertise, peace of mind. I read reviews with a kind of desperate intensity, searching for something I couldn't quite articulate, someone who wouldn't dismiss me, someone who would listen. One name kept coming up, Marianne Cole. People described her as thorough, sharp, unafraid. One review mentioned that she asked the questions no one wanted asked. That line made my throat tighten. I called the number before I could second-guess myself. Her assistant scheduled me for the following afternoon. When I hung up, my hands were trembling. It struck me then how alone I felt in that moment. Not lonely, alone. There's a difference. Lonely implies longing. Alone is just the stark awareness that no one else can stand where you are. Marianne Cole's office was nothing like Grant's lawyers. It was in an older building near the courthouse, the kind with narrow hallways and creaking floors. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Framed certificates lined the walls, but so did family photos and a crooked watercolor painting that looked like it had been done by a child. When Marianne stepped out to greet me, she didn't offer a polished smile. She offered a steady one. "Eleanor?" she asked, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, grounding. She had kind eyes behind rectangular glasses, eyes that missed very little. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything, from the first locked door to the moment I found the documents in Grant's study. My voice shook at times, but she didn't rush me. She took notes, occasionally asking for clarification, her questions precise and thoughtful. When I finished, the room was quiet. "Did you sign these documents voluntarily?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but I didn't understand them. I trusted my husband." She nodded slowly. "And did you have independent legal counsel present?" "No." She leaned back in her chair, exhaling through her nose. "That's significant." Hope flickered, cautious and fragile. "Eleanor," she said gently, "what you're describing raises serious concerns, especially given the power imbalance and the lack of full disclosure." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," she said carefully, "that this may not be as airtight as your husband thinks." For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened just a fraction. I handed over copies of the documents. She read them in silence, her brow furrowing slightly. The longer she read, the quieter the room seemed to become. Finally, she looked up. "Your husband didn't just restructure ownership, he effectively transferred sole ownership to himself." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's more," she continued. "The way this was executed, without your informed consent, without independent counsel, and given the marital relationship, could constitute fraudulent inducement." Fraud. The word landed heavily between us. "Are you saying he committed a crime?" I asked. "I'm saying there's a strong argument that he misrepresented the nature of these documents to secure your signature. That's not just unethical, it can be illegal." I stared at the desk, at the small scratch near the edge that someone probably made with a nervous pen. My hands were folded tightly in my lap. "What do we do?" I asked. Marianne's gaze was steady. "We gather evidence, and we proceed carefully." I became an observer in my own home. Grant didn't know I'd met with Marianne. He moved through the house with a new confidence, making calls, rearranging things, discussing options with people whose names I didn't recognize. He spoke about the house as if it were already a past tense. I watched him now, quietly, noticing details I'd once overlooked, the way he deflected questions, the way he framed decisions as inevitable. I took notes when I could, dates, times, words. One evening, as he reviewed documents at the dining table, I asked casually, "What happens if we sell?" He looked up, surprised. Then he smiled. "We'll downsize, travel more, enjoy life." "And me?" I asked softly. He laughed, as if I'd made a joke. "You'll be with me, of course." I thought of Marianne's words, power imbalance. A week later, she called me. "I've reviewed everything, and Eleanor, I need you to come in." Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my pulse quicken. When I arrived at her office, she had another folder waiting. She did some digging. "Your husband initiated a quiet title transfer 2 months before you signed these documents." I blinked. "That's not possible. He told me the paperwork was just a formality." "It wasn't," she replied. "He set the process in motion before you ever agreed to anything." The room felt suddenly too small. "He also used a legal structure that suggests intent to conceal, and there are discrepancies between what you signed and what was filed." My breath came shallow. "What kind of discrepancies?" I asked. "Material ones," she said, "enough to suggest fraud." I pressed my fingers to my temples. The word echoed again, louder this time. "What happens now?" I asked. Marianne closed the folder. "Now we confront this strategically." The confrontation didn't happen in the living room. It happened in a conference room. Marianne arranged a meeting with Grant and his lawyer under the pretense of clarifying concerns. Grant seemed almost amused by the idea, confident in his control. He didn't look at me as we sat across from one another. He addressed Marianne instead, his tone smooth, dismissive. "I don't see the issue. Everything was done properly." Marianne folded her hands. "Then you won't mind explaining why the title transfer was initiated prior to Eleanor's consent?" Grant's smile faltered, just for a moment. "That's standard procedure, preliminary steps. Without disclosure? Without independent counsel?" His lawyer shifted in his seat. "And perhaps," Marianne continued, sliding a document across the table, "you can explain why the filed version differs from the signed copy." The room went quiet. Grant's eyes flicked to the paper. His jaw tightened. "That's a clerical error."
Marianne didn't blink. It's not. For the first time, Grant looked at me, really looked. There was something like calculation in his gaze, then irritation, then fear. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softer now, "this is getting out of hand." I met his eyes, my voice steady but the storm inside me. "You made it out of hand when you decided I didn't deserve the truth." Marianne leaned forward. "At this point, Mr. Whitfield, we're looking at potential fraud and breach of fiduciary duty." His lawyer cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a recess." Marianne nodded. "I think that would be wise." As Grant stood, his chair scraping loudly across the floor, I realized something important. The man who had once asked me to trust him was now being asked to explain himself, and for the first time, he didn't have an answer.
The recess didn't last long. Grant and his lawyers stepped out into the hallway, voices low and urgent behind the closed door. I stayed seated, my hands folded in front of me, feeling the faint tremor that comes after a surge of adrenaline. Marianne slid a glass of water toward me. "You're doing well," she said quietly. I nodded, though my throat was too tight to respond. Through the thick wood of the conference room door, I could hear muffled words, Grant's voice rising, then falling. It struck me how unfamiliar it sounded when stripped of its usual confidence. When they returned, Grant's lawyer spoke first. "Given the concerns raised," he said carefully, "my client is willing to discuss a resolution." Grant shot him a look, sharp and warning, but said nothing. Marianne tilted her head slightly. "We're listening." The discussion that followed was technical, layered with legal terms and conditional phrases, but beneath it all ran a simple truth. Grant was cornered. The documents he had treated as weapons were now evidence. "We propose a reversion of joint ownership with additional safeguards." Marianne's response was immediate. "That's insufficient." Grant finally spoke. "What do you want?" he asked, frustration seeping through. Marianne's voice was calm, unwavering. "My client wants what she had before you misled her, sole ownership of the property." The room went still. Grant let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's not reasonable." "It's lawful," Marianne replied, "and given the circumstances, it's generous." I watched Grant closely then, the tightness around his mouth, the way his fingers drummed against the table. This was not a man accustomed to losing ground. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Grant's shoulders slumped just a fraction. Finally, he exhaled. "Fine." The word landed heavily, like a door closing. The paperwork took weeks. During that time, the house felt suspended between identities, no longer fully his, not yet fully mine again. Grant moved through it cautiously now, like a guest overstaying his welcome. Our conversations were clipped, logistical. He slept in the guest room. The space between us grew quiet and wide. I spent long afternoons on the porch, watching the light shift across the lawn, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood. I thought about the years I had given to this marriage, about the ways trust erodes not with explosions, with small, calculated cuts. One evening, as I sorted through old photographs, Grant stood in the doorway. "This didn't have to get so ugly." I didn't look up. "You didn't have to lie." He sighed. "I was protecting us." "No," I said softly. "You were protecting yourself." He didn't argue. The final meeting took place on a gray Tuesday morning. I signed documents again, but this time my hand was steady. Marianne sat beside me, her presence solid and reassuring. Grant's signature came last. He hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. When it was done, Marianne closed the folder and smiled at me. "It's over," she said. I nodded, a strange mix of relief and grief washing over me. You don't walk away from a marriage without mourning the version of yourself who believed in it. Grant left without a word. The news traveled quickly. Maplewood was not a town that thrived on scandal, but it remembered it. People asked careful questions. Some offered sympathy, others offered silence, which was its own kind of kindness. Grant moved out within the month. He took only what he needed. The house exhaled after he left, as if it had been holding its breath. One afternoon, I found a note on the kitchen counter. I never meant to hurt you. G. I folded it and placed it in a drawer, unsure what to do with it. Intentions, I had learned, mattered less than actions. The legal consequences followed quietly but firmly. Marianne informed me that the state bar had opened an inquiry into Grant's lawyer for potential misconduct. There were also financial penalties, settlements, fines, the unraveling of carefully constructed plans. Grant's reputation suffered more than he expected. Clients distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. In a town like ours, trust was currency, and he had spent it carelessly. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't need to. Justice, I discovered, doesn't require applause. With Grant gone, the house slowly became mine again. I rehired the landscaper. The garden bloomed fuller than it had in years. I brought back the housekeeper's old schedule. I ordered the antique cabinet I'd once wanted but been told we didn't need. On quiet evenings, I cooked for myself, simple meals, eaten at the kitchen table with the windows open. I relearned the sound of my own thoughts. Sometimes, late at night, doubt crept in. I wondered how I had missed the signs, how trust had turned into vulnerability. But Marianne's voice often echoed in my mind. Being deceived is not the same as being foolish. I held on to that. One morning, as I stood in the foyer watching sunlight spill across the floor, I realized something had shifted. I felt safe. Not because nothing could ever go wrong again, but because I knew I could handle it if it did. The house stood solid around me, walls warmed by memory and resilience. It had weathered storms before. So had I. The quiet after Grant left wasn't empty. It was spacious. At first, the silence startled me. I would pause in the hallway, half expecting the click of his study door or the low murmur of his phone calls. But gradually, the house settled into a gentler rhythm, one that belonged to me alone. I started small. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, angling the armchairs toward the windows instead of the television. I replaced the heavy drapes Grant had chosen with lighter linen ones that let the morning in. Each change felt like a quiet declaration. I am still here. Friends began to visit again, not in a dramatic rush, but in the careful way people approach someone they're not sure how to comfort. My neighbor Ruth brought over lemon loaf one afternoon and sat with me at the kitchen table, her hands folded around her mug. I always wondered about him, she said gently, not accusatory, just honest. I smiled faintly. I didn't. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Sometimes that was enough. The public unraveling of Grant's actions reached its peak a few months later. I wasn't present when it happened, but Marianne called me afterward, her voice measured but satisfied. The court has formally recognized the transfer as fraudulent, she said. Your ownership is affirmed permanently. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. There's more, she added. Grant is facing civil penalties, and his professional license is under review. I thanked her, my voice thick with emotion. When I hung up, I stood in the center of the foyer, the same place where I had once signed away my sense of security, and breathed deeply. It was over. Not erased, not undone, but concluded. Grant tried to reach out once more. He called late one evening, his number flashing on my phone like a memory I hadn't invited. I let it ring twice before answering. "Ellie?" he said, his voice softer than I remembered, tired. "I just wanted to talk." "I'm listening," I replied, though I stayed standing, my back straight. I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "I thought if I had control, I could make things better." "For whom?" I asked quietly. There was a pause. Then, "For me." The honesty surprised me more than any apology could have. "I lost sight of us, of you." I closed my eyes. "You didn't lose sight, Grant. You chose not to look." He exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry." I believed that he was, but belief doesn't require reconciliation. "I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be with me." He didn't argue. He simply said goodbye. When the call ended, I felt no triumph, just clarity. Healing, I learned, is not a single moment. It's a series of quiet decisions. I returned to my design work, taking on a small project for a young couple restoring their first home. They reminded me of myself, hopeful, eager, unaware of how life reshapes plans. I joined a book club at the local library. I took long walks through town, noticing details I had missed before, the way the bakery window fogged up in the mornings, the sound of children laughing near the park. The mansion no longer felt like something I had to defend. It felt like a companion that had stood by me, waiting patiently for me to come back to myself. One afternoon, I found myself in the sunroom, sorting through old journals. In one from years ago, I had written, "I want a life where I don't have to ask permission to be myself." I sat back, the words settling into me with a gentle weight. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that promise. I had mistaken partnership for surrender. But here I was now, wiser, steadier, still standing. The lesson didn't arrive as anger or bitterness. It arrived as resolve. Love should never require you to disappear. Trust should never be used as leverage, and anything built on deception will eventually collapse under its own weight. I didn't lose my mansion. I reclaimed my voice. As I sit here now, the late afternoon light spilling across the same floors I once feared I'd lose, I think about how easily this could have ended differently, how many people sign papers they don't understand because they're told it's easier that way, because they're told trust means not asking questions. If you're listening to my story, I want you to remember this. Your signature is powerful. Your consent matters. And your life, your home, your dignity is never something you owe away for peace. So I'll leave you with this question, the one I had to answer for myself. Life didn't transform overnight just because the paperwork was settled and Grant was gone. That was something no one really tells you, that justice, even when it arrives cleanly and decisively, doesn't instantly restore the rhythm you lost. It gives you ground to stand on, yes, but you still have to learn how to walk there again. The first few weeks after the final ruling, I moved through the house like a guest in my own life. I slept deeply but woke disoriented, unsure for a split second where I was or why the room felt so quiet. Sometimes I reached for my phone in the middle of the night, half expecting a message from Grant explaining everything away, offering some version of closure that no longer existed. Instead, there was silence, honest silence. I began to understand that grief doesn't only belong to death, it belongs to endings of all kinds, especially the ones where the person is still alive, still somewhere in the world, just no longer part of yours. I started therapy at Marianne's suggestion, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how someone like me, careful, educated, independent, could have been maneuvered so thoroughly. The therapist's office smelled like lavender and old carpet. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was never accusatory. Trust isn't a flaw, she told me once, but it becomes dangerous when it's one-sided. That sentence stayed with me. Grant's absence revealed parts of myself I hadn't realized had gone quiet. I began waking early again, the way I used to when I was building my business. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island with a notebook, sketching ideas, writing fragments of thoughts, plans that had nothing to do with compromise. I found old contacts in my phone, clients I'd gently pushed aside when my life narrowed into marriage. I reached out. Some had moved on. Others welcomed me back without hesitation. One woman, a former client named Denise, met me for lunch downtown. "I always wondered why you disappeared," she said, stirring her soup. "You were so good, so sure of yourself." I smiled, not bitterly, just honestly. "I lost my footing." She nodded, as if she understood more than I'd said. "You found it again." I had. The house itself became part of my healing. I went through every room slowly, deliberately. I repainted the study, Grant's old territory, soft sage green. I replaced the heavy desk with a lighter one near the window. That room became my workspace, my refuge, my reminder that space holds memory but can also be reclaimed. In the bedroom, I changed the mattress. It felt symbolic, but also practical. Some nights, practicality is a form of mercy. I donated his clothes, kept nothing sentimental, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed artifacts to explain my past. The house responded the way old homes do, quietly, generously. Sunlight pooled where it hadn't before. The air felt lighter. Even the floors seemed to creak less. Word about Grant continued to drift back to me, though I never asked for it. He moved to a smaller city 2 counties over. His consulting work dwindled. Some people said he was bitter. Others said he was humbled. I didn't know which was true, and eventually I realized it didn't matter. What mattered was that I no longer felt responsible for his redemption. That was his work now. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter in the mail. Not from Grant, but from his son, Michael. We had never been close. Cordial, yes, familiar in the way families sometimes are when love is more inherited than built. The letter was short, handwritten. "Eleanor, I want you to know I'm sorry. I didn't know what my father was doing, but I see now that I didn't ask questions either. You deserved better. I hope you're well. Michael." I sat with the letter for a long time, fingers tracing the indentation of the pen. Accountability, I was learning, can ripple outward, sometimes quietly, sometimes late, but it arrives. I wrote back, not a long letter, just a kind one. The true turning point came on an ordinary morning. I was standing at the front window watching a delivery truck pull away when I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked settled, not younger, not untouched, but present. I realized I hadn't thought about Grant in days, not with anger, not with sadness, not at all. That absence startled me more than the pain had ever had. It meant I had moved on. As the seasons shifted, so did my sense of purpose. I began volunteering once a month at a local women's resource center, not as a speaker, not as an expert, just as someone willing to sit across from another woman and listen. Many of them were navigating financial confusion, legal intimidation, relationships that made them feel small. I never told my full story unless asked. I didn't need to. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "You're not wrong for asking questions." I watched shoulders straighten, eyes sharpen. Power, I learned, is contagious when shared responsibly. One evening, as autumn settled in, I hosted my first dinner party since the divorce. Nothing extravagant, just 6 people, good food, laughter that lingered long after the plates were cleared. The house hummed with warmth. At one point, I stepped into the hallway and listened, the sound filling spaces that once felt hollow. I thought about the woman I'd been when I signed those papers, polite, uncertain, afraid of disrupting the peace. And I felt tenderness for her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. Now I knew more. There's a moment in every story that doesn't announce itself. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with music or tears. It's the moment you realize you trust yourself again. Mine came quietly, standing barefoot in my kitchen, hands dusted with flour, making bread just because I wanted to. No one to consult, no one to explain myself to. Just me. I don't tell this story because I think I'm exceptional. I tell it because I'm ordinary, and ordinary people sign things every day believing love will protect them, believing silence is safer than doubt, believing that asking questions means you don't trust enough. If there's anything my life has taught me, it's this. Trust should never require surrendering your voice. Love should never depend on ignorance. And your home, whether it's a mansion or a one-bedroom apartment, should never feel like it could disappear with the stroke of someone else's pen. I didn't come out of this untouched, but I came out intact. And that, at this stage of my life, feels like grace. There was a winter, after everything settled, that felt unusually gentle. Snow came late that year, light and unhurried, dusting the lawn instead of burying it. I spent most mornings wrapped in a thick sweater, standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the steam rise as if it carried pieces of my thoughts with it. I had learned to enjoy mornings again, not the rushed, performative kind where you align yourself with someone else's expectations, but slow mornings, honest ones. The kind where you listen to your body instead of a schedule, or silence feels like an invitation instead of a punishment. One morning, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I found the original closing documents from when I first bought the house. They were yellowed at the edges now, the ink slightly faded. My name was there, in bold, unmistakable print. No qualifiers, no conditions. Just mine. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, dust clinging to my sweater, and let myself cry, not from pain, but from recognition. I remembered that woman, the one who had trusted herself enough to sign alone without reassurance or permission. I hadn't lost her, I had simply misplaced her for a while. Spring brought renewal in unexpected ways. The garden bloomed earlier than usual, roses unfurling with stubborn determination. I spent long afternoons outside, hands in the soil, grounding myself in something that responded honestly to care. You water, it grows. You neglect, it withers. There was comfort in that simplicity. One day, while trimming the hedges, a young woman stopped at the edge of the property. She looked hesitant, clutching her phone tightly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Eleanor Whitfield?" I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I hope this isn't strange. My aunt told me about you, about what you went through." I waited, curious but calm. "I'm buying a house with my fiancé, and her voice wavered. "I just wanted to ask, how do you know when something isn't right? The question was so earnest, so raw, it caught me off guard. I thought for a moment before answering. You know, I said slowly, when you feel smaller after the conversation instead of stronger. Her eyes filled with tears. We talked for nearly an hour about paperwork, about boundaries, about love that doesn't rush you past your own instincts. When she left, she hugged me tightly, as if we'd known each other longer than an afternoon. I watched her walk away and realized something quietly profound. My story had outgrown me. Not long after that, Marianne invited me to lunch. We sat at a small bistro near her office, sunlight bouncing off the windows, plates between us untouched as conversation took precedence. "You've changed," she said, smiling. "So have you," I replied. She laughed. "That's fair." She hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about starting a community legal workshop. Nothing formal, just education, especially for women who don't realize what they're signing." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not fear this time, but purpose. "If you ever need someone to talk about lived experience, I'd be honored," I said. Her smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." The first workshop was held in the basement of the public library. Folded chairs, coffee and paper cups, a whiteboard that squeaked when written on. Nothing glamorous, but the room filled. Women of all ages sat shoulder to shoulder, some nervous, some skeptical, some visibly relieved just to be there. Marianne spoke first, calmly outlining rights, common red flags, the power of independent counsel. Then she nodded to me. I stood, my hands steady. "I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I trusted someone I loved and didn't realize that love doesn't excuse deception." I told my story plainly, without drama, without blame. The room was silent when I finished. Then questions came, one after another, voices growing stronger as the fear loosened its grip. That night, driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Aligned. Summer arrived warm and generous. I hosted Sunday dinners again, not out of obligation, but joy. Friends lingered long after dessert. Laughter echoed down the halls. The house, once so close to slipping away, felt anchored in community. At one dinner, Ruth raised her glass. "To Eleanor," she said, "for reminding us that strength doesn't always roar." I smiled, touched. "Sometimes," I replied, "it just refuses to disappear." There were moments, of course, when memory surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a phrase overheard in a cafe, the particular cadence of Grant's voice when he used to say my name. But memory no longer carried power over me. It simply passed through. One crisp evening in early autumn, I received a final letter from Grant. Not an apology, not a plea, just a notice that he had legally changed his surname back to his mother's maiden name. I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in a box labeled "Past." Then I closed the lid. Some things don't need interpretation. That night, I walked through the house, turning off lights. In the study, I paused by the window. The desk was cluttered with sketches, notes, ideas for future projects, evidence of a life in motion. In the living room, the clock ticked steadily, not counting down, but keeping time. In the bedroom, the air felt calm, neutral, open. I stood in the doorway and realized something quietly extraordinary. The house no longer felt like something I might lose. It felt like something I belonged to. I don't know what the next decade will bring. I may sell the house one day, I may not. I may fall in love again, or I may not. Life has taught me that certainty is a fragile illusion. But I know this: no one will ever again convince me that love requires blindness. No one will ever again rush me past my own understanding, and no one will ever again hold a pen over my future without my full consent. I have learned to read slowly, to pause, to ask. And in that learning, I have found something deeper than security. I have found ownership of my choices, my voice, my life. The mansion still stands on its hill, white stone catching the late afternoon light. But the most important structure I rebuilt was never made of stone at all. It was built quietly inside me. Time has a way of testing the truths we think we've learned. Just when you believe you've reached solid ground, life leans in and asks, "Are you sure?" For me, that test came not through crisis, but through opportunity. It started with a letter slipped into my mailbox one bright morning in late spring. Thick envelope, cream paper, my name handwritten in careful script. I recognized the logo before I even opened it, a regional historical preservation society. They were interested in my house. Not to buy it outright, they explained, but to feature it, to include it in a series of restored heritage homes, possibly even open it for limited tours. They praised its condition, its history, the way it had been maintained with unusual care. I laughed softly when I read that line, unusual care. For a long moment I stood in the foyer holding the letter, the same place where so many chapters of my life had quietly intersected. Once this house had been leverage, then it had been a battleground. Now it was being recognized for what it had always been, a labor of love. The invitation stirred something complex in me. Pride, yes, but also caution. Opening your doors, I had learned, was not something to do casually. I invited the society's representative, a woman named Clara, to visit the following week. She arrived promptly at 10, clipboard in hand, eyes alight with appreciation. As we walked through the house, she asked thoughtful questions, not just about the architecture, but about how the space was lived in. "Who chose this flooring?" she asked, running her fingers lightly along the wood grain. "I did," I said, 20 years ago. She smiled. "It shows." In the sunroom, she paused. "There's a feeling here," she said. "Continuity, strength." I thought about the years when I hadn't felt strong at all, about how strength sometimes looks like endurance rather than confidence. "I'm glad it feels that way now," I replied. When she left, I sat alone for a long time, considering what it would mean to let strangers walk through rooms that had witnessed my most private moments. Not because I feared exposure, but because I finally understood the value of discernment. I said yes. Not immediately, not impulsively, but thoughtfully. The preparations took months. Research, documentation, gentle restoration rather than reinvention. I worked closely with the society, ensuring the narrative of the house honored truth rather than fantasy. They wanted stories. I gave them context. This room had been a dining room, then a negotiation table, then a place of reckoning. This study had once felt like exile. This porch had held fear, and later forgiveness. "You don't have to include all of that," Clara said gently. "I know," I replied, "but I want to, because hiding my story had never protected me. Understanding it had." The first tour took place on a warm Saturday afternoon. Visitors moved quietly, respectfully. Some asked about the craftsmanship, others about the gardens. A few lingered, as if listening for echoes. One woman, older than me by a decade perhaps, stayed behind after the group moved on. "This house feels earned," she said. I met her eyes. It was. She nodded, as if that was all she needed to know. Hosting those tours taught me something unexpected. I didn't feel invaded. I felt affirmed. Each time I spoke about the house, its bones, its changes, its survival, I heard my own story reflected back with clarity rather than pain. This wasn't reliving trauma. This was integration. Not everyone approved. A distant cousin called one evening, her tone skeptical. "Aren't you worried about privacy? About reopening old wounds?" I considered her question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I'm worried about pretending those wounds never existed." She didn't quite understand, but that was all right. Understanding, I had learned, doesn't require consensus. Around that time, I received an unexpected email from Grant. The subject line was simple: update. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit for 2 days, unread, untouched. When I finally did open it, the message was brief. He had completed a financial ethics course as part of a settlement. He had taken a modest position at a firm far outside his former sphere. He wrote that he was learning what accountability actually meant. There was no request, no apology, no attempt at reconnection, just information. I closed the laptop and sat quietly. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt closure, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles gently like dust after a long road. The following autumn, I traveled for the first time in years, not because someone suggested it, not because it made sense on paper, but because I wanted to see something new. I went to a small coastal town 3 states away. I stayed in a modest inn overlooking the water. I spent mornings walking the shore, evenings reading by the window. One night, as the tide rolled in steadily, I realized how much my relationship with uncertainty had changed. I no longer needed guarantees to move forward. I needed alignment. When I returned home, the mansion greeted me not as something fragile, but as something patient. I unpacked slowly, cooked a simple meal, opened windows, and I understood then that home is not defined by ownership alone. It's defined by agency. Winter came again, sharper this time, but I was ready for it. I hosted a holiday gathering for the women from the library workshops. We decorated together, shared stories, laughed over mismatched ornaments and imperfect cookies. One woman, recently divorced, pulled me aside. "I thought starting over meant losing everything," she said quietly. I shook my head. "Sometimes starting over means reclaiming what was always yours." She smiled, eyes shining. Late one night, as snow began to fall outside, I stood at the top of the staircase and looked down into the foyer. The clock ticked, the house breathed. I thought about all the versions of myself that had passed through this space: the ambitious woman, the trusting wife, the frightened signer, the determined fighter, the steady survivor. They all belonged here. None of them were mistakes. If there is a final lesson in all of this, it's not about marriage or property or even betrayal. It's about authorship, about who gets to write the terms of your life. For a while, I let someone else hold the pen. Now it rests firmly in my own hand, and I read every line before I sign.
There are seasons when life asks nothing of you but presence. No decisions, no defenses, no proving, just presence. That was the season I entered after the house tours slowed and winter settled fully into the bones of the year. The days shortened, the world grew quieter, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with explanations, mine or anyone else's. I spent mornings reading in the sunroom, the light pale and patient. Afternoons were for writing, notes, letters, fragments of memories I didn't want to lose. Not because they hurt, but because they mattered, even the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones. One afternoon, while sorting through an old cedar chest in the guest room closet, I found something I hadn't seen in years, my original wedding album. I sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy book resting on my knees. The cover was cream linen, slightly frayed at the corners. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what I was bracing for. But when I turned the first page, I didn't feel pain. I felt distance. There we were, Grant and I, standing under an arch of late summer flowers. I looked radiant, not naive, not foolish, just open. I studied my own face for a long time. She didn't know, I murmured softly to the empty room, and that's okay. I closed the album and placed it back in the chest, not with bitterness, but with respect. That chapter didn't deserve erasure, it deserved context. In early spring, Marianne called again. "I wanted to let you know," she said, "the case is officially closed, all appeals exhausted." I thanked her, feeling the finality of it settle in my chest like a stone dropping gently into water. "Eleanor, I don't say this often, but you changed how I practice." I smiled. "I hope in a good way." "In the best way," she replied. "You reminded me why clarity matters." After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long while, hands folded, absorbing the truth of what she'd said. Pain, when faced honestly, can educate more than comfort ever could. As spring warmed into early summer, something unexpected happened. I was approached by a local publisher. They had attended one of the preservation tours, had listened carefully, had taken notes. "We think your story could help people," they said, careful not to pressure, "not sensationally, thoughtfully." The idea unsettled me at first. I had told my story many times by then, in fragments, in conversations, in quiet guidance, but putting it on paper for strangers felt different, permanent. I asked for time. Weeks passed. Then one morning, standing in the kitchen watching light dance across the floor, I realized something simple. My story no longer felt fragile. It felt ready. I agreed not to dramatize, not to accuse, but to document, to leave a record of what happens when trust goes unquestioned and what's possible when it's reclaimed. Writing the manuscript was slow, deliberate work. Some days I could only manage a paragraph, other days hours slipped by unnoticed. I didn't write in order, I wrote in truth. The signing day came late in the process. When I reached that chapter, I stopped. I stood up, walked through the house, touched the walls, breathed, then returned to the desk and wrote it, not as a climax, but as a turning point. Because that's what it was. Not the end of my power, the beginning of my awareness. Late one afternoon, while editing the final draft, I received a knock at the door. It was Clara from the Preservation Society, holding a small framed photograph. "We wanted you to have this," she said. The photo showed the house at dusk, windows glowing warmly, the porch light on. It looked welcoming, steadfast. I thanked her and hung it in the hallway near the stairs, not as a trophy, as a reminder. There was one final loose thread I hadn't expected to revisit, a call from a bank representative. They were updating records and needed confirmation regarding an old joint account, one that had been opened years ago and quietly drained before I'd ever noticed. "I'm sorry," the representative said. "We assumed your husband had authority." I closed my eyes briefly. "No," I said calmly, "he didn't." There was a pause, then paperwork, then corrections. Even now, echoes of the past tried to assert themselves, but they no longer found a place to land. On the anniversary of the day I'd signed those papers, I did something intentional. I hosted a quiet dinner, just myself. I set the table carefully, cooked a meal I loved, lit a single candle. I didn't mark the date to mourn it. I marked it to honor what came after. I raised my glass, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. "To discernment," I said aloud. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Older, yes, lines earned, not feared, eyes clear. I thought about how often women are taught to shrink uncertainty, to smooth it over, to prioritize harmony at the expense of comprehension.
I thought about how easily silence is mistaken for peace, and I promised myself again that I would never confuse the two. The mansion remains, not because I fought harder than anyone else, but because I chose to stop surrendering ground without understanding the cost. One day it may belong to someone else, but the lesson it gave me will remain mine forever.
I stood on the porch that night, snow settling softly around the edges of the garden path. The wind carried a faint scent of pine, crisp and clean, and the world felt still, as if holding its breath. For a long moment I simply breathed, in and out, in and out. No past pressing on me, no fear whispering in my ear, just the quiet, steady rhythm of life unfolding. The house behind me was warm, full of light and memory. Every room held its story, every corner a witness to the journey I had endured. But the story that mattered most was not the one etched into walls or paper. It was the one living in me. I had been tested, betrayed, forced to relinquish trust and ownership, and yet I had returned, not as the frightened, uncertain woman who signed those papers, but as someone whole, aware, and unshakably present. There was no triumph in revenge, no satisfaction in witnessing consequences. There was only understanding, clarity, and the steady reclaiming of agency. I had learned that strength is quiet, discernment is powerful, and resilience is not defined by what is lost, but by what is rebuilt. I looked up at the stars, faint and distant, scattered across the winter sky, and I understood, finally, that my life, my choices, my voice, these were mine alone. I turned back to the mansion, feeling its steadfast presence around me, and I whispered to myself, I am here. I am whole. I am free. The wind stirred, and a single snowflake landed softly on my hand. I smiled, letting it melt. It was a gentle reminder that life, like this snow, comes in layers, each one falling, landing, and passing, leaving room for what truly matters to remain. And in that quiet, luminous moment, I felt a peace I had thought I would never know. The house, the memories, the lessons, they were all part of me now, and so was I, finally, entirely, unconditionally. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, letting the warmth of the home envelop me. I had survived. I had reclaimed my life, and I would continue steadily, intentionally, fully present for all the days to come.